The heating makes too much noise. I have to turn it down. Anyhow, it's getting cold in Yerushalayim. Even the winters here are not usually that cold, but sometimes during the day. But if I turn off the heating, so okay. Let's get back to this. So here we are. 1 second. Okay, can you see that? This is taken from the Zohar on Genesis, on Bereshit, 149a. It's just a very short example again. And you can see how the Zohar has, as I said, the approach to the text is not, is always looking for the esoteric part of the text in the Zohar. It's not much more than it's looking for the simple meaning or even to analyze the text. It's almost like the simple meaning of the text is secondary. And also there's also a tendency of Zoharic texts. Whenever they find a verse which is really difficult to understand, they get excited. Okay, because if it's that illogical, obviously there's a great secret. So that's also that's a tendency also. Okay, as it says about Jacob in Genesis, and he dreamed and he dreamt. It really should be and he dreamt. And he beheld a ladder standing on the earth with its head in the heavens, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on the ladder. Okay, so you remember that verse in Genesis about the dream of Jacob, where he sees a ladder that starts from the ground, goes up into the heavens, and angels are going up and down the ladder. Now, just to give you a comparison, the Midrash, which is, again, the rabbinic interpretations of the Second Temple period. The Midrash says, who were the angels who were going up and down the ladder? And the Midrash says that these angels were the angels or the spiritual roots of the various kingdoms, the various nations, which were going to subjugate the Jewish people in the diaspora, in the exile. So, because in Midrashic thinking, every nation has its spiritual root. That's why when God battles Egypt, he says to Moses, Uvachol Elohei Mitzrayim aseshvati. I'm also going to bring plagues to the gods of Egypt. Of course, the simple meaning of bringing plagues to the gods of Egypt just means to show the Egyptians that their gods are worthless. That's the simple meaning. But in Midrashic thinking, in order to overcome a nation, you have to overcome its spiritual root. This is Midrashic thinking. I'll give you another example. When Jacob is about to meet Esau, his brother, Esau. So it says that the night before he went across the river, this is in chapter 37, he goes across the river, and all of a sudden this man fights with him all night long. And the man realizes that he cannot overcome Jacob. And then he hits him in his thigh. And he hurts Jacob, and Jacob was limping after that. Then the man says to Yaakov, to Jacob, he says, let me go because it's now the morning. Jacob says, I'm not going to let you go unless you bless me. And then the man says, well, your name, what is your name? He says, Jacob. He says, no, it's not going to be your name anymore. Your name is going to be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men, and you have prevailed. Struggle with God and with men, meaning God, meaning this angel. This man was an angel. You fought with an angel, meaning you struggled with God. With men, Esau, your brother, and you have prevailed. So the Midrash, the rabbinic interpretation says, before the Jacob meets Esau, he has to be able to overcome the spiritual root of Esau, because Esau is going to be a mighty nation. And the spiritual root is this angel that he's fighting with on the other side of the river in the middle of the night. And then the next day when he meets Esau, after overcoming the angel, Esau is his best friend again. So it's an interesting idea that not only do human beings have a soul, but nations have a spiritual root. Their cultural root, if you want to put it that way. This is a rabbinic idea found in the Midrash, which is rabbinic homiletics from the Second Temple period. So the Midrash on this particular verse, where Jacob sees angels going up and down the ladder, the Midrash says that the angels were the angels of the nations that are going to subdue, are going to dominate the children of Jacob in exile. And who were these angels? It would be, of course, Egypt would be one. And then after that, it's Babylonia. And after that, it's the Greeks. And after that, it's of course, some people say the Persians. Some people don't call Egypt because we became a people after we left Egypt. Some people say, what were it's called the four exiles. So it's Babylonia, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Those are called the four exiles. Babylonia, which was the 70 years. Persia, because the Persians took over from the Babylonians. Some people put them together, by the way. So it's either Babylonia, Persia, Greece, or Rome, or those who put it together say Egypt, Babylonia, and Persia, Greece, and Rome, depending on how exactly you look at it. It's called the four various exiles of the Jewish people, the nations that exiled us. In fact, in rabbinic thinking, we are still in the Roman exile. The Romans conquered the world, and their descendants basically continued in that particular exile. And Abraham ibn Ezra, living in Spain, he says that the fourth exile is actually Ishmael, meaning the Arab countries, the children of Ishmael. He makes them the fourth. So he actually, the way he does it is, he says Babylonia and Persia together, Greece, Rome, Ishmael. But there's this tradition of the four exiles of the Jewish people. So the Midrash says that Jacob saw the angels going up and down. And which were the angels he saw going up and down? The angels of the nations who are going to subdue his children. So he saw the angel of Egypt going up and down. And he saw the angel of Babylonia going up and down, because these nations, they become great and then they go down. And then he saw the nation of Greece, their angel, going up and down. And then he saw the angel of Rome going up, and he didn't see it coming down. And then it says that Jacob was afraid. And then when God appeared to him, he said, don't worry, that angel will go down too. Of course, we have to understand that the Midrashim, these Second Temple rabbinic texts, are being written under the Roman occupation. So obviously, the way they're interpreting it is that Jacob sees the angel going up and he doesn't see it coming down, because they're writing at the end of the Second Temple period. But when they say that angel will go down too, in other words, this is the way they understand. So all the angels go up and they go down. But that interpretation is what I call a historizophical interpretation of Jacob's dream. It's looking for meanings in Jewish history, you might say. The Zohar doesn't do that. I mean, sometimes it does, but not in these texts. Sometimes in what's called Tikkunei Zohar, the part of the Zohar where they have 70 different interpretations of the word Bereshit, which means in the beginning. There's a text like that called the Tikkunim. But the Zohar, as I said, is always looking for something about the spiritual dimensions of the world. So let's read this. And he dreamt, and he beheld a ladder standing on the earth with its head in the heaven. The angels of God were ascending and descending on this ladder. Now, Just like in the Midrash, when it says he opened and said, we had this before too, it means that in the academy, there's a rabbi who's getting up and giving an interpretation. That means he opened and said. Whoever is giving this interpretation, he opens by quoting a verse and then interpreting the verse and then eventually connecting it back to this story of Jacob's ladder. That's called he opened and said. Here it doesn't tell us who the person was. Maybe it was the person who was mentioned before. He opened and said, there was the word of the Lord to Ezekiel, the son of Buzi, the priest in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Kfar, and the hand of God was upon him. This is Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1. I think we read it before. Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1. And in the verse it says, there was the word of God to Ezekiel ben Buzi, the priest, the Kohen in the land of the Chaldeans. In the Hebrew it says, how do you say there was? Hayo, haya. In modern Hebrew, there was is just haya in the past tense. In biblical Hebrew, very often you have a double word. It's sort of like a double verb, if you want to put it that way. Instead of there was, it's sort of like I'm trying to think how to say it in English, and I don't know how to say it in English. But they double the verb. Hayo, haya. Hayo is the root of haya. So they're using the root, and then they're using it was. It's sort of like if we were talking in French, for instance, and we were talking about avoir, which is a verb, and you wanted to say vous avez, so if I would translate it into the way it's done in Hebrew, in biblical here, it's sort of like vous avoir avez. In other words, I'm giving the structure of the root, and then I'm saying the exact indication of how I want to formulate the root. That's called hayo haya. Hayo is the root of the word haya, and then haya. This double verbs happens a lot in biblical text, and it seems to be a style of writing of the time. Hayo haya. You can find that quite a bit in biblical text in the Old Testament. Hayo haya, and it basically means haya. There was. So sometimes you'll find that it just says haya, like ish haya be'eretz utz v'yov shmo, the first verse of the book of Job. There was a man in the land of Uz or Oz, and his name was Job. And there it just says haya, because it says there was a man. But here it doesn't say there was a man. So they use the verb, meaning they use sort of like the root of the verb and then the conjugation of the verb. Hayo haya. So the Zohar now wants to understand why the Bible does this. Why does it do hayo haya? Because after all, you can just write haya, which means there was. And it means the same thing. So the simple answer is, that's the style. That's the style of biblical Hebrew. That's the way it does it. It's not the first place. But for the Zohar, that's not good enough. They want another interpretation of why it's doubling up here. Okay. Hayo haya. Here we are, right over here. Why does it say hayo haya? Why does it double it up like this? So the Zohar is going to give its interpretation of why it's doubled up. It means a prophecy for that time. Reason why it doesn't just say there was a prophecy, but it says hayo haya, and it doubles it up. It's to teach you that the prophecy was just for that time. It was necessary for the exile of the divine presence, which in Hebrew is the Shekhinah, which descended into exile with Israel. What's the problem here? The problem is like this. Usually prophecy is in the land of Israel. All our prophets were prophets in the land of Israel. I'll give you an example. Abraham was a prophet. Isaac was a prophet. Jacob received prophecy. Jacob's sons go down to Egypt. Joseph, if you remember, when he's a young man in the land of Canaan, he has a true dream of what's going to happen at the age of 17, that his brothers will bow down to him and his father. But when he goes to Egypt, he doesn't have any prophecy. And neither does Jacob once he goes down to Egypt. Once they leave the land of Israel, prophecy stops. And it does not return until Moses sees the burning bush on the Mount of Horeb. And Moses is told to go down to Egypt, and then God returns prophecy. And he has to bring the people out of the land and bring them back to the land of Canaan. So for that time in the exile, prophecy stops. Moses given prophecy because God has to use him, you might say, as the emissary to take the Israelites out of the land of Egypt. But his prophecy is for bringing them back to Israel. So in that sense, the Zohar is trying to understand why all of a sudden Ezekiel receives prophecy in the land of the Chaldeans under the Babylonian exile. What was the purpose? Since it doesn't normally happen, was there a purpose for this prophecy? Hayo haya, meaning a prophecy for that time. It was necessary. So why was it necessary? It was necessary for the exile. That's why it happened in the exile. For the Shekhinah, the divine presence, Shekhinah comes from the Hebrew word shachan, which means to dwell, to be present. Very often, the divine presence, it said, was over the tabernacle, the Mishkan, when Moses entered. Sometimes that was represented by a cloud, which was hovering over the tabernacle to represent the idea that divine presence was in the tabernacle. So it was necessary for the exile, for the Shekhinah, the divine presence, descended into exile with Israel. And Ezekiel saw what he saw at that time when the presence descended. Even if he did not see the divine presence in its original lofty place. Therefore, it says, Hayo haya. What is Hayo haya? Hayo, the dot is above, on top of the word. Haya, the kamatz, the vowel is under the word. So that's to teach you what was above is now below. Meaning, when somebody like Moses speaks to God, so he gets a revelation on a very high level. So it's like talking to a God on a very high level. Ezekiel, being in the land of the Chaldeans, in the exile, he receives his prophecy on a very low level. So even though it's still prophecy, it's from far away. It's like, you remember I talked about at the beginning of this course about the idea of prophecy on different levels. And I said it's almost like when you are in a thunder and lightning storm. And the further you are from the eye of the storm, the further the lightning and the thunder will be apart, because sound travels slower than light. So Ezekiel is on a much lower level. So he sees the divine presence from as if from a very far distance. Whereas Moses sees it much more clear, sort of like being in the storm. But nobody can see the essence. That's why it says, when Moses says, show me your countenance, show me your face, God says, no person can see my countenance and live. So you can only see from behind. Anyhow, so hayo haya. So since in the Hebrew, the question is, are we talking about nikud? Are we talking about the vowels the way they're written? Or are we talking about the vowels the way they sound? I'm going to assume for a moment we're talking about the vowels the way they sound. Hayo is like at the top of the mouth. Haya is sort of like at the bottom of the mouth. Why am I saying that? Because the way we actually put the dots on the words in Hebrew, the cholam on top of the word and the kamatz under the word, that was only developed in the 7th and 9th century. So Now, it's true that the Zohar is, as a book, comes out in the 13th century, so they could have known that too. But I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt that maybe it could also have been before the 7th century. So I'm giving it both possibilities here. Therefore, it says, a ladder standing on the earth and its head in the heavens, meaning prophecy itself is a ladder standing on the earth with its head in the heavens. Ezekiel is seeing it from the earth, from a very low point. Moses is seeing it higher up on the ladder. And every prophet sees it on their level, wherever they might perceive on that ladder. Isaiah is a little bit higher on the ladder in his perceptions than Ezekiel. They're all in a body standing on the ground. But it depends on your soul, how lofty your soul is, and how high up the ladder your soul can get when you get into such ecstatic type of disposition. So anyhow, what I wanted to show you, there seems to be two things going on here. But the main thing which is trying to say is that he's seeing prophecy. He's seeing it in the exile, but he's seeing it from a much lower perception. Much lower perception. Did that make sense to anybody? Two people nodded. Everybody else was, oh, okay, whatever. Yeah. Any questions? Okay. I think somebody else just joined. Adriana, right? Yeah, I think so. Okay. If there are no questions, I want to go to a different topic. Okay. What I want to do is, oh, here's somebody else, right? Who just joined recently? Did anybody else just join? Did I miss? Okay.
Yes, I did so too. You wanna buy?
Oh, this? Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, I'm going to open up here. I'll take it in English, but somebody can read it simultaneously. Okay, basically finished. I gave you. Okay, which means we've been going sort of quickly. That's okay. So we have this meeting and the next meeting. So what I'd like to do is in the Pericopa of the week, we started the book of Exodus a week and a half ago. Last Sabbath, we read the second portion, the Sabbath before that, the first. So I want to do a little bit of the book of Exodus, and I'm going to throw into it the way the Midrash and a little bit of the way the Kabbalists see it, just to give you a feeling of how it's a little bit different. By the way, I saw a wonderful article, they have an academia.edu, if you know that site. There are people who write, I call them like pre-publication articles, like 4-5 pages of their idea that they want to write about. And one of them was actually very good. So about, so I think I'm gonna send it to you, but after. Okay, but not
Yes, but sometimes not all are free.
Oh no, this one is free. Yeah, don't worry about it. New York Times does that. People send you a link, and then if you have to pay for subscription if you want to read it. Okay, where is this? So let's take then Exodus. Start from the beginning. Exodus 1. Not the Hebrew one. Okay, Sepharia. Okay, what we'll do is we'll do it simultaneously. You'll read it first in Romanian, then we'll do the English. So let's take a little bit. Okay, here I have it. What's this? And I'll do share. No, that's not it. There it is. Okay, would somebody like to read? Somebody have it in Romanian. You can read it, and I'll just comment. We're going to start from the beginning of the book of Exodus, and just go maybe through this pericopa. That's about it, or maybe just parts. We'll see how far we'll go. Does somebody have it? That's Exodus chapter 1.
Da, înmulțirea israeliților în
Yeah.
Egipt.
Before you start, I want you to realize the book is called Exodus in Greek. In Hebrew, it's called Shemot. Does anybody know what Shemot means? Shemot means from the Hebrew word Shem, which means a name. The names. As it starts, these are the names of the sons of Israel. Now, in antiquity, I think I mentioned this, very often books were just called by the first, second, or third word of those books. So you might say it's just arbitrary. The word Shemot, which means names, happens to be the second word in Hebrew. What I want to argue is, even though, by the way, Nachmanides also calls the book of Exodus, he calls it the book of redemption, which is very similar to saying Exodus, right? You're redeeming these slaves from Egypt, which definitely is a major theme in the book, not a question. But I want to argue that the word names is also a major theme in the book, and this is something I'm going to explain. Okay, please continue again. These are the names.
Ok. Iată numele fiilor lui Israel care au venit în Egipt. Au venit cu Iacov, fiecare cu familia lui. Ruben, Simeon, Levi și Iuda. Isahar, Zabulon și Beniamin. Dan și Neftali, Gad și Asher. Și toate sufletele ieșite din coapsele lui Iacov erau un număr de 70 de suflete. Iosif era în Egipt.
Right. So Joseph was in Egypt. And what about Benjamin?
He was mentioned earlier, wasn't he?
Yes. Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin. Right. That's correct. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Joseph is over in Egypt. Of course, we're missing Dinah, the daughter. Remember, there was a tragic story with Dinah. She was kidnapped and raped, and eventually there was a double terrible story because her brothers who wanted to redeem her had to fight for her and had to kill for her. And it's quite a tragic story. And Jacob basically curses these sons in his that they were much too vengeful and too military in their dealings with Dinah. But I assume Dinah also must have come down too. Yes, continue. The total number of the persons.
Și toate sufletele, should I read it again?
No, 5.
Ok. Și toate sufletele ieșite din coapsele lui Iacov erau un număr de 70 de suflete. Iosif era în Egipt.
Okay. Until now, we have the names of the family of Israel. Israel, who is Jacob. There are 70 people in his family. Rashi actually makes a whole interpretation of how you get to the 70, but later on in this pericope, I think they actually mention the 70, who the 70 are with their children. And these are the 70 who go into Egypt. And then the Israelites go to Egypt as a tribe. They emerge from Egypt as a people. So you might say the birthplace of the people of Israel was Egypt, which is an interesting idea. The birthplace of Abraham was Ur-Kasdim in Iraq of today, Mesopotamia. But as a people, meaning you have individuals before, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel and Leah, but these are individuals and families, and they become sort of a tribe as they go down to Egypt, but they come out of people. Let's continue. Until now, you have all these names. Everything sounds interesting, but from verse 6, everything is going downhill.
Și Iosif a murit și toți frații lui și toată generația aceea. Fiii lui Israel erau roditori, s-au mărit, s-au înmulțit și au ajuns foarte puternici și țara s-a umplut de ei.
Right. So Joseph dies and all of that generation, but so far it doesn't seem so terrible because it says the Israelites were multiplied, increased, and everything seems fine. But from verse 8, after Joseph dies, not only does everything not seem fine, but it's almost like the names become erased. There's a certain narrative where we're going to see that the names are becoming erased from the narrative. Yes. 8.
Peste Egipt s-a ridicat un nou împărat care nu cunoscuse pe Iosif. El a
Now,
zis,
what's happening here? There is a new king who arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. You should know then the whole book of Exodus. How do we call the king of Egypt? Everywhere in the book of Exodus, how is the king of Egypt referred to as?
Pharaoh.
Pharaoh, always Pharaoh, even though Pharaoh is not his name, because you have Pharaoh Ramses and you have Pharaoh later on Akhenaton, you have different pharaohs. Pharaoh is the official name, but this is probably the only verse in the whole book where it says a new king arose over Egypt instead of saying a new Pharaoh. It's almost like we forgot his name. And this king forgot Joseph's name. He didn't know Joseph. It's very unusual. There are historians who try to explain it this way. They claim that there was a tribe called the Hyksos who took over Egypt, which was, it's a theory. And this new king who was not Hyksos, he was the new king. And that's why he didn't want to know anything about Joseph, because the Hyksos, who are also from this part of the world, they didn't mind having a Hebrew among them, whereas the Egyptians did mind. Because remember, with Joseph, the Egyptians didn't like sitting with the Israelites, with the Hebrews. So that's the way the historians interpret it. But I want to interpret it a little bit more. I'm claiming that the narrative is trying to make a double point. I call this the, if you want to, let's say there's like the meaning of the text and there's the meta meaning of the text. Okay. In other words, I'm trying to say the text is trying to suggest things the way it says things. Just like when we read the book of Ruth, and I was saying the names of places and names of people are suggesting things. The absence of a name can also suggest something. So we had all the names of the family of Joseph, and all of a sudden there's a new king who we're not even calling him Pharaoh. It's as if he doesn't have a name, and he forgets the name of Joseph. It's now rubbed out. There never was a Joseph. Let's continue. Verse 9.
El a zis poporului său, iată poporul fiilor lui Israel este mai numeros și mai puternic decât noi. Hai să ne purtăm cu înțelepciune față de el, ca să nu se înmulțească, pentru ca nu cumva, dacă se va întâmpla un război, să se unească și ei cu vrăjmașii noștri, să lupte împotriva noastră.
9 and 10, yes?
Didn't finish the sentence.
I'm sorry.
Să se lupte împotriva noastră și să iasă apoi din țară.
So, this new king, who we don't even know his name, he's not even referred to as Pharaoh, says to his people, the Israelite people are much too numerous. Do you notice something here? Of course, you don't see the Hebrew. The Hebrew says, Hine am b'nei Yisrael. This people of Israel, the Israelite people. But he says the people of Israel. In other words, Pharaoh is the first one in Jewish history to call this tribe a people. God promised Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that their descendants would become a people. But the first one to realize it was this new king over Egypt. Probably before the children of Jacob realized it. Which is very interesting. Sometimes your enemies see qualities in you that you didn't realize you had. In general, in history, people who come from the outside are able to see things that other people don't see. And they can take advantage of it too, meaning they can also see the weaknesses, not just the strengths. Napoleon, who came from Italy, right? He was able to see things in France that the French people were not able to do. So that helped him get to a leadership quality. Stalin, who came from Georgia, was able to see something in Russia that the Russians were not able to see. I mean, this is true of, even, as I said, of a lot of dictators, and the bad ones too, like Stalin, or like Hitler, who came from Austria. He was able to see in the Germans things that they were not able to see. And sometimes, whatever. I'm trying to think of examples in Romania. Do you have examples of Romania? I can't hear you because you're on mute.
Sorry, not exactly, but most of our rulers, our leaders were Romanian.
We're local.
So,
Well, the only thing I can think of.
Well, we can speak about the dynasty of Hohenzollern. Yes, if we can speak about them, but they were good rulers, and they raised somehow the level of the society. And
Okay, and where did they come from
Where
originally?
the kings
Germany.
from Germany.
Yes, from Germany.
Okay. Sometimes when people come from the outside, they're able to see things from a different vantage point. And as I said, they can either use it for the good or they can use it for the bad. But because when you live in a certain area, you don't always see how the other people see it. And then you don't also see the opportunities that the other people can see from the outside. So I'm just saying this. So the interesting thing is that Pharaoh looks at this tribe of Israelites, of Hebrews, and he says, this is a people. He's the first one to notice it. They didn't notice it. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's very interesting when you look at it. He says to his people of Egypt, the Israelite people are too numerous. They're going to overtake us. They're going to join our enemies. Okay? I don't even think the Israelites realized that, or else they wouldn't, right? They wouldn't have allowed to happen what actually happened if they were really had that possibilities, because they wouldn't allow themselves to be enslaved. But I guess they didn't know how to use their talents to keep their freedom. So I'm just saying that this happens. Let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of a war, they'll join our enemies, fight against us, and rise from the ground. Okay, 11 and 12.
Și-au pus peste ei supraveghetori ca să-i asuprească prin munci grele. Astfel, el a zidit cetățile Pitom și Ramses ca hambare pentru faraon. Dar cu cât îi asupreau mai mult, cu atât se înmulțeau și creșteau și s-au temut de fiii lui Israel.
Okay, they built two cities, Pitom and Ramses. That's why a lot of people think that this Pharaoh was actually Ramses, because one of the cities was called Ramses, Pitom. That's so that's one of the theories, that this Pharaoh was Ramses, who's, by the way, his mummy. Do you say mummy in Romanian?
Mumie?
Mumia, yeah. We say in Hebrew also mumia, was in the British Museum until about 30 years ago. And then they sent it back to Egypt. And when it got back to Egypt, it fell apart. Because, I don't know. But that was the Ramses. The more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out. At 13, the Egyptians, okay, one moment. Let's see how far we should go. Okay. Let's go 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17.
Ok, 13. Atunci egiptenii au obligat pe fiii lui Israel la o muncă aspră. Le-au făcut viața amară prin lucrări grele de lut și cărămizi și prin tot felul de lucrări de pe câmp. Și în toate muncile acestea pe care îi sileau să le facă, erau fără niciun pic de milă. Împăratul Egiptului a vorbit moașelor evreice, numite una Șifra și cealaltă Pua, și le-a zis: când veți moși pe femeile evreice și le veți vedea pe scaunul de naștere, dacă este un fiu, să-l omorâți, iar dacă este o fiică, să o lăsați să trăiască. Dar moașele s-au temut de Dumnezeu și n-au făcut cele poruncise împăratul Egiptului, ci au lăsat pe copiii de sex masculin să trăiască. 17, yeah?
Yeah, that's it. Okay. So the Egyptians want to deal ruthlessly with the Jews, basically Pharaoh, Ramses, if it was Ramses. And he says, we're going to give them hard labor. They're going to build our cities and all different tasks in the field. And then, to make it worse, he tells these Hebrew midwives, Shifra and Pua, whenever you see a boy, kill him. Whenever you see a girl, let her live. Because the girls don't fight in the army, the boys do. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt had told them, and they let the boys live. Who are these midwives? Who is this Shifra and Pua? And how did they have the character and the bravery to stand up to the king of Egypt and not do what he said? Let me ask the first question. Were they Hebrews or were they Egyptians? From the text, it's not clear. From the text, you could prove that they're Hebrews, and from the text, you could also prove that they were Egyptians. What's the most obvious proof that they were Hebrews?
They were afraid of God. They have only one God.
That's one possibility. Give me another proof from the text that it looks like they themselves were Hebrews.
But they say the Hebrew, aren't they say Hebrew?
It says in verse 15, the Hebrew midwives.
Yeah.
Now the question is, does that mean that they were Hebrews? Or does it mean they were the what? Midwives of the Hebrews?
Yeah.
You understand?
Question. Okay.
That's the question. And I tell you why. There's a reason for this. Let's just think for a moment. Pharaoh wants to kill the boys. Now you have professional midwives. And when it says he spoke to the Hebrew midwives, obviously they're midwives who were also for Egyptians, right? If you're going to speak to a Hebrew midwife who was actually Hebrew herself, she would probably not want to kill the firstborn. Or maybe she would do a job every now and then, but somebody she didn't like, but she would try to refrain. So why would then Pharaoh should have sent non-Hebrew midwives with soldiers to do this, you would think. So that's one problem of saying that they were actually Hebrew midwives, because how can you expect them to do it? That's number one. Number two, let's look at verse 18, 19. What do they answer Pharaoh? Verse 18, 19, and 20.
Și împăratul Egiptului a chemat pe moașă și le-a zis: de ce ați făcut lucrul acesta și ați lăsat pe copiii de sex masculin să trăiască? Moașele i-au spus lui Faraon: pentru că femeile evreilor nu sunt ca egiptencele, ele sunt vânjoase și nasc înainte de venirea moașei. Și Dumnezeu a făcut bine moașelor și poporul s-a mulțit și a ajuns foarte puternic.
Right. Okay. The midwife is saying to Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not the same as Egyptian women. Okay. Now the question is like this. If these were Hebrew women, they might be able to say that Hebrew women are different. But how do they know how Egyptian women are? They've never seen how Egyptian women are. If they're Egyptian, they would have seen both. Right? So from this verse, it actually looks like they're not Hebrew women. Because they're saying the Hebrew women are different than the Egyptian women, meaning they're familiar with both. The Hebrew slaves would have not been familiar with the Egyptian women at all. They wouldn't have been able to make a statement like that. But, as I said, so the simple text is not clear whether these midwives were Hebrews or not Hebrews. As I said, because it says the Hebrew midwives, some people say that they were Hebrews. In fact, the Midrash says that Shifra and Pur were actually Miriam, who was the sister of Moses, and Yocheved, the mother of Moses. That's what the Midrash says. But the simple meaning of text does not necessarily mean that. Let's just think for a moment, according to the simple meaning of the text, that these midwives were not Jewish, but they feared God. That means you have people who fear God just naturally, out of intuition. By the way, this is not the first place you see this in the book of Exodus. In last week's Perikopa, which is just a few chapters ahead, it says those who feared God, right before Moses says that there's going to be hail over Egypt, the seventh plague, hail. How do you say hail? It's like very heavy snow that comes down in pellets.
Ninsoare grea, nu cred că există nume special în română pentru așa ceva.
I'm sure there's a word for hail. Hail is like pellets, like ice that comes down from the sky.
Grindină, but this is not snow, it's
It's
water.
pieces of ice.
Just
Exactly.
ice.
In English, you say hail. In Hebrew, you say barad. How do you say in Romanian?
Grindină.
Okay, it goes. You can hear it.
Yeah,
You
grindină.
can hear it on your car, machina going like that.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so it says those who feared God brought their animals into the houses before the hail came down. Meaning they were Egyptians who feared God. It's interesting. Hayared Varashem says specifically in the text. Okay, there you can say, well, this is already after Moses brought 6 plagues against them. So they got the idea. That's possible. But it's interesting that if Shifra and Pua were non-Hebrews, there are non-Hebrews in Egypt then who are fearing God, which is interesting. That's what it sounds like. I wanted to point that out. Now, another interesting thing, where it says here, I don't know how it translates in Romanian, it says, Hebrew women, 19, not like the Egyptian women. In Hebrew, it says they are vigorous. How is it translated in Romanian?
Sunt viguroase, sunt puternice. Cred că ei au tradus cu
Oh,
putere.
same thing, vigoros, vigoros.
Au
Okay.
tradus vânjos, da, mă rog, vânjos este
They're very strong.
stylish. Vânjos is a sort of metaphor. It's viguros after all. It's
Okay.
quite vigorous.
This is the way he translates it here. That would mean in Hebrew, it says chayot. Chayot can either mean a lot of vitality, but it can also mean like an animal, which means just like animals give birth naturally. So certain human beings, because they are slaves and they're used to surviving, they learn also to do this. When you need to survive, you need to learn how to survive. So your neighbors learn how to be midwives. So that's another possibility for chayot. So I just wanted to point this out. The Hebrew does says chayot. By the way, the Hebrew word chayot in Aramaic of midwife is chayata, which is somebody who brings life. It comes from the word chayim, chaya, which is life. So the midwife is called somebody who helps to bring life in Aramaic. And then the Hebrew word for the Hebrew women doing it themselves is chayot also, which is the Aramaic word for the midwife, which is also interesting. Okay, let's go a little bit further. God dealt with the midwives and their houses multiplied because they feared God. He established houses for them. So what I want to say here is that you have a case here, according to the simple meaning of a text, of non-Hebrews who are trying to help these people. The text, in my opinion, is first of all telling you there are good people everywhere. Okay, which is interesting. Right at the beginning of the story, you have these people, they say, this is wrong. We're not going to say to the king, this is wrong, but it's wrong. If he wants to find somebody else, he'll find somebody else. Now, this is going to happen twice. Okay, we still go, or are you getting tired of reading? So Pharaoh said to his people, every boy that is born, throw him into the Nile and let every girl live. In other words, Pharaoh realizes he can't have individuals. He tells the people to do it. Meaning the people, the Egyptians, who don't like the Hebrews, are going to go down to their houses and watch and make sure it happens. He's letting the gangs get involved. Because they're too many, it didn't work the first way. Now we're in chapter 2. Things are going downhill. How does chapter 2 start? Read the first verse of chapter 2 now.
Un om din casa lui Levi luase de soție pe o fiica lui Levi.
Right. So there's a man from the house of Levi who marries a woman from the house of Levi. We don't know his name. Okay, verse 2.
Femeia aceasta a rămas însărcinată și a născut un fiu. A văzut că este frumos și l-a ascuns 3 luni.
Now there's a baby who is born to this couple, and he also does not have a name. Remember what I told you before about the names disappearing? Now the names have disappeared. Not only did Pharaoh originally not have a name, but on the Hebrew side, the names are disappearing. There's a man from the house of Levi, we don't know his name, a woman from the house of Levi, we don't know her name, and they have a son who doesn't have a name. This son will get a name. Who's going to give him his name?
The Pharaoh daughter.
Exactly, Monica. It will be Pharaoh's daughter. We don't know Pharaoh's daughter's name, by the way, but she will give the name to Moses. What is the meaning of this? In my opinion, that there's a meaning to this. They will tell us later who these people are, but not now. This idea of wiping out a name, what is the meaning of a name? Remember, the pericopa starts with names of Jacob's family. Then there is a king, no name, who can't remember Joseph's name, right? Meaning he can't remember Joseph. And then this king wants to kill the firstborn and then put all the Hebrews into slavery. And then there are, of course, 2 righteous women who stand up to the decree of the king and try to slow it, but you can't stop it. You can only slow it. And then the king gets the gangs of people to make sure that this happens. So then you have a man from the house of Levi who marries a Levite woman. They have a son. She hides him for 3 months, but it's not enough. She cannot hide him any longer. She gets a wicker basket. Okay, you want to read 3 and 4 and 5.
Nemai putând să-l ascundă, a luat pentru el un coșuleț de papirus pe care l-a uns cu lut și cu smoală. A pus copilul în el și l-a așezat între trestii pe malul râului. Sora copilului pândea la o depărtare oarecare ca să vadă ce îi se va întâmpla. Și fiica lui Faraon a coborât la râu să se scalde. Și fetele care o însoțeau se plimbau pe marginea râului. Ea a zărit coșulețul în mijlocul trestilor și a trimis pe roaba ei să-l ia.
And 6.
Ok. L-a deschis și a văzut copilul, un băiețaș care plângea. I-a fost milă de el și a zis, este un copil de-al evreilor.
Right. Now, Pharaoh's daughter knows that it's a Hebrew child, and she knows that her father said they have to die. Now, she decided she's not going to let this child die. Again, we come across a righteous person who is not a Hebrew for the second time. Again, according to the interpretation that Shifra and Pua were Egyptians. So, but here for sure, Pharaoh's daughter is not a Hebrew. It's not even a question. And Pharaoh's daughter sees a Hebrew child. She knows it's a Hebrew child and decides to go disobey her father. And then the sister says to Pharaoh's daughter, we know the name of the sister, but here the sister doesn't have a name. Again, the whole family, it's as if anonymous family. We know who the sister's name. What's her name?
Miriam.
Miriam. The sister who is watching from far away, she says to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child? Somebody, okay? Pharaoh's daughter should have said, she could have said, I think it should be an Egyptian, right? But she didn't. She said, good idea. And then the girl went and called the child's mother. Who's the child's mother? Yocheved, right? So, and Pharaoh's daughter has no problem with this. So Pharaoh's daughter says to her, chapter 9, verse 9.
Fiica lui
9 and 10.
Fiica lui Faraon i-a zis, ia copilul acesta, alăptează-mi-l și îți voi plăti. Femeia a luat copilul și l-a alăptat. Copilul a crescut și l-a adus fiicei lui Faraon și el i-a fost fiul. I-a pus numele Moise, scos, căci a zis ea l-am scos din apă.
Right. Now, where does the child grow up? It's not clear here. It looks like for the first couple of years, Moses was actually living with his mother. That's what it looks like. And only later, it's not clear. Because it said when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter and she made her son. So it looks like in the first couple of years, he's actually growing up with his brethren. And then she gives him the name Moses because I drew him out of the water. Now, there are, of course, a lot of questions you can ask here in the simple meaning of the text. What does it mean, Moses, because I drew him out of the water? Was Moses an Egyptian word or was Moses a Hebrew word? So that's the first question. The obvious answer should be that Moses was an Egyptian word because Pharaoh's daughter probably did speak Hebrew. And I'm assuming if she spoke to Miriam's, because Miriam started speaking Egyptian to her because she was born there. So she knew the language. That's what I'm assuming. And probably her mother was born there too. And she called him Moses. There's a lot of speculation about this. The Hebrew text says his name was Moshe, ki min hamayim mishitihu, because I drew him from the water. In Hebrew, limsho is actually to draw. So it actually sounds like the Bible is giving a Hebrew meaning to the name. He was drawn from the water. But how would Pharaoh's daughter give a Hebrew meaning to the name of her son when she's Egyptian? And it specifically says that Pharaoh's daughter gave him the name and not Yocheved, not the mother. So I'll tell you what I speculate. What might be going on here. If you remember, the term Ramses is the Pharaoh. What does Ramses mean? Meses means the son of. Ra is one of the gods of the Egyptian pantheon. It was the sun god. R-A, Ra. So Ramses means the child of the sun god. Meaning this king calls himself, or his parents called him, the child of the sun god. Moses, I'm assuming that Moses was pronounced by the Egyptians, Meses. I'm just assuming, because Meses means the son of. In other words, she probably said the son of the Nile, but the Bible didn't want to call him that. So the Bible just said the son of, and slightly changed it to Moshe to accommodate the Hebrew. That's what I'm speculating. But he was the son of. She probably called him the son of the Nile because she drew him from the Nile. But if you just leave it in Hebrew, Moshe, then it becomes to draw. So it's okay. In other words, you can play with the Hebrew and the Egyptian here back and forth, and it can still come out the same. And that's what I think it actually means. I drew him out of the water. For the Egyptians, saying that she drew him out of the Nile would be very significant because the Nile is one of the gods of Egypt. Just like the sun is one of the gods of Egypt. So drawing from the Nile means that he is a special child. The Nile gave us this child, right? So for the Egyptians, that would be very symbolic. That would be very significant. Seeing a boy flowing in the Nile, right? And if you remember the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel says about Pharaoh of Egypt, of course, this is a much later Pharaoh. He says, but you, Pharaoh of Egypt, who were saying, Li yoriv ani asitini, who you keep saying, the Nile is mine and I created it. Meaning I am a stronger God than the Nile. You have that in Ezekiel, right? There's the pantheon of Egypt includes at least 15 different gods. And Nile is one of them. Another one, of course, if you probably remember, was the cobra, which was on the crown of the kings. You had the cobra snake. That's why, by the way, if you remember when Moses comes to see Pharaoh for the first time, he brings 3 signs. The first sign is his staff turning into a serpent and then back into a staff. Because the serpent is one of the gods of Egypt. The reptile. There are two types of gods of Egypt. One was a serpent, the other one was the alligator. One was the cobra, serpent, and the other one was the alligator in the Nile. Both of them are reptiles. And by the way, in Hebrew, both of them are called tanin, interestingly enough. So the Hebrew word tanin seems to be a reptile. Both the alligators and the snake are called tanin in Hebrew in this text. And then the next thing that Moses does, if you remember, is which is also the first of the plagues, he takes water from the Nile, which turns to blood. It's almost like he's killing the god of the Nile. And he's playing around with the god of the reptiles. It's to show the Egyptians that the God of the Hebrews is stronger than the gods of Egypt. But again, you have this Pharaoh's daughter. Again, another righteous non-Hebrew who takes pity on this child. And I just find this very interesting. Shifra and Pua. And by the way, also, it's all women. There's another woman in this pericopa who plays a very significant role in the Exodus story. Do you know who I'm referring to? Aside from Pharaoh's daughter and Miriam and Yocheved in this story, who basically saved Moses' life, mostly Pharaoh's daughter, but in addition, Miriam and Yocheved, the sister and the mother. There's one other woman in this pericopa who's going to save Moses' life. A very, very strange story.
It's Moses' wife.
Yes. Do you remember the story?
Yes,
Okay.
I remember. It's when she, I don't know the word, but save him from the angel of God.
That's correct.
Ajutați-mă puțin cu tăierea împrejur, că nu știu cum să zic în engleză.
The circumcision. I
Yes.
guess. Yes.
Right,
I
right.
was thinking
Of a son.
about his wife, but I don't know the story. Anna knows
Okay,
the
it is-
story.
It's a very strange story. It's Exodus chapter 4, verse 25. Exodus chapter 4, verse 25.
Sephora, atunci Sephora.
Sephora, that was the wife of Moses. Sephora.
Yeah.
Which means-
it's translated Sephora in Romanian.
Yeah, so Sephora, by the way, means a bird.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of women in the Bible have names after animals, birds, things like that. In general, in biblical narrative, animals are seen as human friends. We eat them, of course, but because, you know, in an agricultural society, animals are part of your life. The people live in one building, the animal live in another building, but they're very close proximity. So, you know, it's that type of, I guess in the villages in Romania, it's quite like that too. Everybody has their chickens and has their maybe a cow or two. So when people live in such a surroundings, they become very close with the animals. And then when they have a child that they like, they give it a name like an animal. And that's an endearing name. Like Rachel, which means Rachel, is a lamb. A lamb. Mouton. Right? And as we said here, Tzipora is a bird. And Devorah is a bee, which produces honey, of course. And Rebecca means a barn where you keep the animals. It's a barn where you keep the animals. Okay, not all the names. Of course, Sarai was a Babylonian name, which became Sarah. Sarah means like a minister, somebody who's very important. Trying to think what other names.
Caleb.
Anyhow,
Caleb.
Sure.
Caleb
yeah.
is it means dog or
Which
from
one? Kalev.
Caleb.
Kelev, yeah.
Kalev is probably from Kalev. Yes, yes. Kalev ben Yefuneh, who was the first judge, and together with Joshua was one of the two good spies. Kalev ben Yefuneh. Dogs in general, by the way, have a very good depiction in the book of Exodus. It says that they didn't bark when the Hebrews had to leave. So they didn't want to give it away. Lo yacharatz kelev l'shano. Not one dog barked in Egypt, so that nobody would know that at midnight they were leaving. So, which is also interesting. So Tzipporah, in this first story of the book of Exodus, okay, I want to answer two things now before I get to this, okay? But I will answer why I think there are a lot of women involved in this. But number one, let's just go back for a moment. I said that you have the names of the children of Jacob. They are 70 people, and then all of a sudden there's a king who we don't know his name. We don't even know his title, Pharaoh. And he said he forgets Joseph, as if he forgets Joseph's name. And then you have a man from Levi who marries a woman from Levi, and we're not told their name, who has a child, and we're not told his name, until Pharaoh's daughter comes along and gives him a name. What does this all mean? And this is my interpretation. A name is an identity. When I call somebody by their name, and I say Monica or Iliana, so I'm talking to that person as a person. They have a soul, they have thoughts, they have values, they're a person. They're not just an object. A slave is an object. A slave is a number. They're just there to build this and to build that, and who cares about it? A slave is a loss of names, a loss of identity. As the Hebrews are becoming slaves, the names disappear. That man from Levi doesn't have a name. That woman from Levi doesn't have a name. The child doesn't have a name. In order to receive a name, they need a name from a free woman, from Pharaoh's daughter. She gives a name to Moses. She helps him get his identity as a free man. But slaves are not free men. They have no names. So, in my opinion, the narrative here is trying to create a meaning of what's going on here. Names and loss of names. Names are identities. Loss of names is the enslavement, the lack of freedom, and then in the Exodus, they will get their names again. So I'm saying there's a real connection between names and Exodus. It's not arbitrary. It becomes something very symbolic. And why does Pharaoh's daughter give the name to Moses and not his mother? Because it's the free woman who can give the name, not the slave. So, in other words, why does Moses have to grow up in Pharaoh's palace and not among his brethren? Because he has to see everything from a different vantage point. He has to learn what it can be to be a free man, because a slave can forget. You know that there's Abraham Ibn Ezra, a Bible commentator from Spain in the 11th century. He says, explain one thing to me, he says, in this book of Exodus. He says, how many people left Egypt? Well, we know from the book of Numbers that the males from the age of 20 to 60 were 600,000. That's what it says in the book of Numbers. Well, we know that there were also children, and there were women, and there are at least as many women as men, maybe more. So there were probably 2 million people who left Egypt, including definitely the mixed multitude of the Egyptians who joined them. There had to be at least 2 million people. Now let's just think for a moment. The Egyptians, when Pharaoh came with his 600 chariots and all the chariots of Egypt, how many people were they chasing after the Israelites going towards the Red Sea? 30,000? 40,000? How many could there have been? 50,000? The very fact that the verse says there were 600 chariots and all the rest of the chariots, that means the rest of the chariots were maybe another 3,000, 4,000, 10,000, right? So let's say there are 50,000 soldiers chasing after 2 million people. How do the soldiers win? Every person can pick up a rock, can pick up a stick, just throw it at them and just start clubbing them. They're 2 million people. So Abraham Ibn Ezra says the problem is when you have slaves, as soon as the slave hears the crack of the whip of the master, they freeze. Psychologically, they don't know how to fight because they grew up as slaves. Their whole life was slaves. They've never tasted freedom. They don't know what to do. And when Moses says, we're going, they say to Moses, it was better back in Egypt. There, at least we knew what we were doing. They don't understand the advantage of not being a slave. It gets that bad. So that's what Ibn Ezra says. They weren't able to fight back. All the Egyptians had to do was use their lassos, crack that whip, and they would all freeze and just, they needed leadership. So this idea of the names is very significant in my opinion. And Moses is the one who gives the Jews back their name because he grew up in the palace. This is also significant. If you take the Hebrew word for the name Moses, Moses is written in Hebrew like this: Mem, Shin, Hey. Or if in biblical Hebrew, we would write it like this: Mem, Shin, Hey, right? It's Moshe. There's a little dot up here, 3 dots under there. If you take the letters Moshe and you turn them around, you read them backwards, it comes out the name Hashem. Moses represents the name. He's giving the name back to the Hebrews, names that they lost. Now, there's something very significant about that. He's giving the name. So Moses is giving back the names to the people, meaning he is the leader who's going to teach them how to be free because they have no idea. Why? How does he know how to be free? Because he was free from the minute he was born. He bumped into Pharaoh's daughter after 3 months. Yes, she gave him back to his mother, but said, nobody's to touch him. He's mine. You're just watching him until he grows up a little bit. Then he'll come to me. So Moses grew up as a free man, at least until his, let's say, 20s. Then, of course, you know the story. He goes out to his brethren. He sees an Egyptian policeman hitting a Hebrew slave, and he kills the Egyptian. And which was a very big move on his part, because that meant the end of his freedom. It was a big decision on his part to kill an Egyptian. And he comes back the next day and sees 2 Hebrews fighting between each other and says, why are you fighting? And they say to him, who made you the minister and the lawman over us? Are you going to kill us the way you killed the Egyptian? So when Moses here understands that everybody knows about this, he runs to Midian. Anyhow, but before that, so Moses is going to give back the name. The name is the identity to the people. What's the next? And then what happens in the same pericopa? Moses meets God at the burning bush, the revelation. God says, I have heard the difficulties of my people in Egypt and the suffering and the pain and the screaming. I want to send you. Moses says to God, but if they ask me your name, what am I supposed to say? Very interesting. Why is that important? Why can't he just say the one God? What does that mean if they ask me your name? What am I supposed to say? For somehow Moses realizes that his job here is not only to free the Jews. Of course, they're not called the Jews, they're called the Hebrew at this point. The Jews is the descendants of Judah. But not only to feed the Hebrews, but to help them make sense out of their relationship with God. So they have to know who you are, which means, what is your job? I want to explain what that means, by the way. Because God doesn't answer him in this pericopa. What does God say when Moses says, "What's your name?" God says, "I will be, which I will be." Eheyeh, asher eheyeh. Sometimes that's translated, "I am, which I am." In the Hebrew, it's "I will be, which I will be." And then God says to Moses, "Tell them I will be sent you." It sounds like God's not answering. And the funny thing is that in the next week's pericopa, God appears after Moses goes to Pharaoh and shows the signs. And Pharaoh says, "No, I'm not going to let them go. And in fact, I'm going to make their work twice as difficult." And Moses says to God, "Why did you send me? Now everything is worse." And God says to Moses, "Don't worry, you'll see what will happen." That's the first pericopa. The second pericopa starts. God appears to Moses and says to him, "I have appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the name El Shaddai. And the tetragrammaton, the four-letter name Havaya, I never revealed to them." Do you remember that from the text? So next week's pericopa, he's going to say a name. But when Moses says to God, "What's your name?" he doesn't actually say the name. What is that about? In the Hebrew language, first of all, what is a name? Let's start with that. When I say somebody's name, not only is it their identity, but it's also the way I understand their identity. You see, there are two parts of having a name. One is the way I call myself, and the other one is the way other people call me. Right? The way other people call me is the way they perceive me. So if somebody says to me, Rafi, which is my name, right? So for them, my name is what, as long as they've known me, if they've known me for 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years, whatever interactions between myself and that person happened, that's the name for them. Right? Now, it could be they don't know me at all. Maybe the whole time I didn't like them, so I pretended I was somebody else, right? There are also people who can do that. They can pretend they're somebody, but they're not. But the name is whatever that person perceived of you. The name for yourself is the way you understand yourself. That's something else. The Hebrew language has the most names of God of any language. Take, for instance, in English, you have God, the Lord, and that's it. I don't know in Romanian how many names you have, but they're really, in English, they're really very few. In Hebrew, you have, according to Maimonides, 7 main names of God. According to the Kabbalists, 10 main names of God, and then many connotations. Names of God are like the Tetragrammaton, the main name Havaya, which is very popular in the Bible. Then the word El Shaddai, the word Yah, Yud Hey. Then you have Tsevaot, the God of hosts, which is also called Elohei Israel, the God of Israel. Elohim is another name. Right? So you have all these like names, and then you have combinations. Havaya Tzvaot, Elohim Tzvaot, El Shaddai. So, and then you have connotations. Like in Isaiah, the holiness of Israel, Kadosh Israel, the rock of Israel. Various names, the place, Hamakom. We have that in rabbinic literature. Even peace in rabbinic literature is considered a connotation of God. So, many, many names. Since we don't know the essence of God, the names are how God interacts with his creation. And in rabbinic thought, the different names represent the different interactions. The name of Elohim is the name of judgment. The name Havaya, the name of compassion. The name El, the name of loving kindness. El Shaddai, the natural name. Aleph Daled Nun Yud, the name of majesty. So each name then has a certain attribute or a way that God governs the world. When Moses says to God, "What is your name that I tell them?" which means they're going to want to know what your place is. Because after all, 200 years, you didn't pay much attention to them. So they want to know now, what is your place now in this story? You see, that's what I mean by your name. In other words, we have the story. We're trying to figure out who the players are. I'm a player, Moses. My brother Aaron will be a player. Maybe my sister Miriam will be a player. Okay, I got that. Pharaoh, of course, is a player and all his men. But what is your task in this play? Are you just going to stand aside and wait for another 200 years? Or are you going to do something here? God says, I will be there and I will be there. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, hey, yeah, sure, yeah, is not just blowing him off saying, I don't need you. That meaning that's not a question. I will be which I will be. No, he's saying, I will be there. Even though you don't realize it. I will be there and I will be there. I'm not knocking the other interpretation. I think the translation in English, I don't know how you say it in Romanian, I am which I am, is interesting. It is a very interesting idea. I'm not against it. But I'm saying if we took the exact etymology of the word in Hebrew, I shall be which I shall be, you could explain it the same way, meaning I will be what I will be, and that's it. That's like saying I am that I am. But if you're trying to understand how he's answering Moses at a critical point, where Moses really wants to know how God is going to be involved here, when God says, I will be which I will be, meaning I'll be with you. I will be there. Don't worry about it. You don't have to see me. You don't have to know my name. I'll be right there the whole time. I will be which I will be. That's the way the Midrash translates it, and also Rashi, the famous commentator from the 11th century. I will be there all the time. And then in a few chapters, God says to Moses, I revealed myself to the patriarchs, and the word El Shaddai, meaning through the natural world. But with you, it's going to be in a different name, because everything is going to happen differently in this story. It will not be in a natural way. So we have to use the name Havaya, the special name of God. So this whole chapter is talking about names, from names of people to lack of names of people to the name of God and the relationship of God to this people. And Moses is the master trying to figure out, or the maestro, trying to conduct exactly between the people and God and figure out how this is going to work. I just want to end off this idea of the names because I want to finish now. If you remember the biblical story in Genesis, when Adam was created, even before the creation of Eve. So it says, Adam called names to all the animals. He gave them all names. A human being looks for meaning, looks for significance. He sees, or she sees things around. What is this animal and how am I going to relate to it? The lion, okay, I have to keep away from him. Dogs and cats, they're okay. Rabbits are fine. Birds seem to be okay if they're not vultures. So I need to know my place with all these things. So Adam giving names to the animals is understanding his place in nature with all the animals. So human beings, what we do is we try to make sense of our world. And so Moses is trying to help the Jews become free, giving their name back. And what the next thing a human being does when they're free is control the world, not be subdued by the human being. Once I'm the master of my world, I can now try to understand what it means and what my place is. And if I have a place in this world, that means I have a talent that this world needs too, because everybody has a talent. Even people who think they don't have a talent, they do have a talent. And if you can't discover it, somebody will figure it out and they'll become jealous of you. You won't even know why. In fact, all those people who don't like you, it's because they realize that you have something that they don't. So think about that next time that somebody says something to you. Because sometimes the other person is smarter than you on that, meaning they're street smarter than you. You know, it's street smart. Some people have like intuition and they pick up things about you that you don't even realize they have, but they do. And they're using that as an advantage because they don't want you to use it. So they say, oh, you're not this, you're not that, right? With children, that happens a lot, but even among adults, sometimes we don't realize that we have all these talents and abilities because somebody told us we didn't. Einstein's 5th grade math teacher flunked him in math. Okay, it was the whole class. It wasn't just him. It's a famous story. But I'm just saying, you know, you have things like that in history. And I'm sure somebody told Beethoven he could never play music because his hearing was really bad. So I'm sure that happened. And eventually he did lose his hearing and he continued creating symphonies as a deaf person. How he did it, I don't know. But somehow he was able to do it. So that's one of the interesting things about this story. Okay, I think that's enough for now. I just wanted to give you like a different angle of how a biblical text can be seen when you combine it with the simple meaning of the text, when a little bit midrashic meaning from the rabbinic interpretations, and the thing of the name, slight Kabbalistic angles also at looking at names. Okay, merci beaucoup, everybody, and I wish you good evening. And next week is our last meeting. If there's something specific that you want to do, if not, I'll look for something myself. And I will try to also prepare maybe questions to help you prepare for the examination. I'll think of how to do that. Okay. Bunasera. Shalom, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.